All right. So today I want to talk about my speculations on Neuvillette's personality, potential character arcs based on the Japanese dub casting of Kamiya Hiroshi in the role. I've done Act 1 of the Archon quest, so I'm a bit behind, and it may be easier to just play it and see more of his personality, but I'm really curious to see if my thoughts so far are right. After our very brief introduction to him, and I want to share my thoughts before I play through it so that I can look back and reflect, right? And also then others will also be aware. The story isn't over, so I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of him in the future, even after this patch update. And I want to see how well my ideas hold after this. So as a disclaimer, this is kind of a prediction video, but because of that, I'm not going to be discussing any leaks, and anyway, I avoid spoilers, so everything I'm guessing is pretty much based on already known information up until the end of Act 1 of the Archon quest. I have been spoiled on one small incident in the Archon quest Act 2, but it doesn't actually play any part in this analysis as far as I've written it, so it should be no problem. So, I know that a lot of people have been saying that the Japanese dub for Neuvillette has been their least favorite, and the main point of contention seems to be about how young or how high his tone sounds, since it doesn't seem to suit the authoritative position that Neuvillette holds as the Chief Justice of Fontaine. He also looks a bit older than other characters, at least in some of the 2D art. And based on what we know from the tabloid article in his strip marketing and talking to NPCs and Melusines in particular around Fontaine, he is actually very old. So I do get it. It makes sense to expect his voice to be a bit lower or deeper. And every other dub, including the original Chinese, has gone with a lower voice, right? But I do want to make a case for Kamiya Hiroshi, and I think that aside from his star power as one of the most well-known and prolific voice actors in the Japanese dubbing industry, I think the choice to cast him was an intentional one made on the basis of the character of Neuvillette. As my friend Seiya Kozuki pointed out on her stream, the Japanese dubbing industry is the largest and most established among the 4 languages voiced in the game, so they experiment a little bit more with their casting choices rather than simply providing voices that match physical characteristics of a character. Their voice actors do also often get typecasted, which is why we're doing a deep dive into Kamiya Hiroshi and his characters, because they're good at performing a certain type of character archetype, or they shot to popularity because of a particular character. So this is common in any performance or acting industry. I wanted to approach an analysis of Neuvillette's possible characterization from this angle. It may come off as a defense of the Japanese casting, but I think that I do have some things to reinforce my impression of Neuvillette thus far. Like I mentioned earlier, Kamiya Hiroshi is a very prolific voice actor known for many roles. It was actually very difficult to pinpoint which archetype Neuvillette falls under, but there are a few well-known ones that have been a major hint for me as to what I think the characterization of Neuvillette may be going forward. So I want to talk about Natsume from Natsume Yujinso, Yato from Noragami, Araragi from the Monogatari series, Rampo from Bungo Stray Dogs, and Saiki from The Disastrous Life of Saiki K. To some extent, I will also mention Izaya from Durarara, but he's a darker version of these characters, and there are a lot of places where he doesn't really fit in. As a note, I do know that he voices Levi from Attack on Titan, but I haven't watched Attack on Titan, so I don't really know if he falls under this category at all. But I'm sure chat can let me know if they are our viewers. I'll begin with a quick summary of the characters that I've listed, since some people may not have seen these anime. Natsume from Natsume no Yujinso is a boy with the ability to see yokai. Yato from Noragami is a homeless god, or almost god. Araragi from the Monogatari series is a loner who has been turned into a half vampire. Rampo from Bungo Stray Dogs is a master detective whose superpower is the ability to deduce the truth from any crime scene. And Psyche from The Disastrous Life of Psyche K is an Esper, which means that he has psychic powers, basically. So, what do all of these characters have in common based on these descriptions so far? The first thing that we need to know is that they are outcasts. Everyone around Natsume has found him creepy since he was young, and he was passed from house to house until he ended up living with distant relatives whom he hides his secret ability from. He has no friends among people at the beginning of the series, and he even tried to avoid yokai up until the start. Yato has no friends because he was a former god of calamity and caused trouble everywhere he went. He did terrible things and is struggling to earn his place among other gods. Araragi isolated himself from the crowd, warning spoilers, because he saw the worst in people and in himself after an incident that ruined a student's reputation. And Rampo is so brilliant that he can't comprehend the stupidity of common people around him, and at one point ended up thinking that everyone must have been lying to him and taking him for a fool. Psyche is a psychic who can read everyone's minds and thus can't engage in normal human interactions. So I know there are a lot of loners in anime. Usually, however, these are deuteragonists or those who fall into the anti-hero trope. They still do good, all while pretending not to care about the larger society. And they're often mistaken to be indifferent or downright dangerous by the people around them. But that's not the case with the characters that I've listed, Kamiya's characters, who are often actually well loved in and out of their universe. And why is that? It's actually because they are ultimately the main protagonists through and through. What I mean by that is that they are the heroes of their stories. They are the aspirational heroes, no matter how weird or how flawed they may be. So most of the time, these characters are well liked or well respected. Other characters in the story reinforce the idea that these are characters that we should be rooting for. Most of the people around Natsume see his vulnerability and take care of how they treat him. Despite all his efforts to distance himself. The president of the Armed Detective Agency recognizes Rampo's fear and vulnerability early on and basically adopts him to not only nurture his talent, but to protect him. Everyone around Araragi likes him, is drawn to him for his kindness, despite his desire to remain invisible and detached. And I think Neuvillette is a character who has a certain image himself, but is seen differently by those around him compared to how he sees himself. He seems to be an idol of sorts amongst not only the Melusines, but also among the people, the regular people of Fontaine. On a more superficial level, many of these characters act in service of a larger community as well. So this is where things get a little bit more specific. Yato wants to be a god who protects people. Rampo is a detective who helps solve crime. Araragi, at least at some point, wanted to be a police officer. And Neuvillette is obviously a civil servant. He is a judge tied to a duty where he has to maintain neutrality and mask his feelings while looking over a nation of people much more vulnerable than he seems to be. But aside from their actions, it's clear they have an established moral code and deep compassion and empathy for others. This is pretty common among most heroes, so I'm not going to delve too much into that. You all know those characters. But what makes Kamiya's characters a little more memorable than the usual optimistic protagonist who always does what's right no matter what is his characters actually aren't always innocent or are acting in a certain way simply to fit into society, not because they completely agree with or even share society's values. Yes, Levi is a captain of a survey squad, apparently, so I guess that also fits. His particular niche is characters who, in fact, hold themselves not only apart from society intentionally, but at times even above it. So they recognize that humanity is flawed, even corrupt, and they may even sneer at it at times. There are moments where Yato is downright cold, having stated that those who want to end their own lives should just do it. And even providing a bullying victim with a weapon with which to harm one of his bullies. Psyche can hear everyone's like idiotic thoughts, so it's no wonder that he looks down on his peers, um, even his family at times. And I hadn't mentioned him earlier, but Uramachi Onisan is also a character who obviously like thinks he's working like amongst idiots, right? But at the same time, despite all of this, they maintain a strict adherence to their own set of beliefs that still leads to good or moral or heroic actions and even sacrifice. Um, a lot of these characters actually have a bit of a self deprecation complex, right? They don't value themselves enough. So, in short, his characters have very complex histories, strict ideologies, and at the same time, a deep compassion for others. And they also stand apart from society while putting an effort to protect and serve the community. So, quite honestly, I expect Neuvillette to be a pretty good guy with a rich internal self, rich internal being, trying to project himself a certain way so that he can serve his nation, but perhaps being received a little bit differently than he expects. But there are definitely VAs with lower voice registers who can do characters like this. So Kamiya-san obviously isn't the only talented VA out there, even if he is my favorite. So why pick Kamiya-san to portray Neuvillette? Why go with a voice that may contrast so differently with his appearance when you could do all of these things with the same type of character, but with someone with a lower voice? Just like how Natsume is very different from Yato, Saiki, Rampo, and the rest, I think Kamiya-san is actually has taken a very masterful approach to Neuvillette, a unique approach to Neuvillette in order to present another distinct version of this archetype. He subverts expectations of hot authoritative judge man, right? But it's not only that, his softer tone hints to us immediately at a softer side to Neuvillette right from the start. That is to say, from the very first trailer, and we should have really seen this coming. We should have known about what Neuvillette was like kind of from the beginning because of this choice. Kamiya Hiroshi is known for his energetic portrayal of characters who betray a much more emotional side than they reveal to others. And this is an easy way to make a distinction between an outer performance and an inner self, adding layers to a character. He's certainly not the only one to do this, but he also has the range to give us a lot more. He voices Yato, who can go from being a loud, obnoxious idiot to a very cold and menacing threat. And it's believable. He also voices Izaya. So I did mention I would be mentioning Izaya. And he appears charming and friendly, but turns into a crazy narcissist the more you get to know him. He also voices Natsume, who is generally gentle and soft-spoken, but has moments where he also gets more serious. And I don't want to say that we should be looking forward to all of these aspects from Neuvillette, but I am going to be keeping my ears peeled. In any case, Kamiya's experience over the years has provided him with a broad range. He has the ability to portray characters in this archetype in such unique and special ways so that none of them really blends in with the other. And his latest challenge seems to be Neuvillette, who he and the voice direction team has chosen to present as someone who is both elegant and, I am going to argue, incredibly awkward. So now we're going to take a look at Kamiya's Neuvillette. From our first meeting, Neuvillette speaks in a soft and gentle voice. I believe he's chosen this vocal register to try and ease the anxieties of those around him. I don't mean Kamiya-san, I mean Neuvillette has chosen this vocal register. This implies to me a self-awareness that he is not the same as everyone else, and he's aware that his presence may indeed stress others out. One of the NPCs we meet when we first arrive in Fontaine even jokes about being brought before him as punishment for speaking too directly or disrespectfully about the Archon. And it is a joke, however, and that implies that the Fontainians have great faith in his fairness and justice. But for Neuvillette, it may not be just a joke. Neuvillette may see it as a real concern and has been trying to blend in with human society. However, he cannot escape the fact that he does not fully fit in, and he indeed seems very awkward about it. Rather than tactfully waiting for Paimon to introduce herself and the traveler, just when she's about to do so, he speaks first and gives away that he overheard them, which makes the conversation awkward from the start, and it gets ever more awkward as it goes on. When he's asked if he's Linny's friend, he responds very carefully, saying that he would be Linny's friend if he so wished. But it's very clear from that answer that they're not close. And the response itself is already unique, but the implications of it I find even more fascinating. By saying that he would, if that's what Linny wanted, he seems aloof or as though he's pretending not to care and is just being polite, which is a really strange way to act when you have front row center seats for the show. When Linny does introduce him and his lofty position, he logically tries to explain all of that away and asserts that he's just like everyone else. Except it's obvious that while everyone may have assigned seats in the courtroom or the opera house, only the Chief Justice would be sitting in the high up seat that Linny pointed out to first. So ultimately, it's not a very convincing argument. It's just his attempt at blending in. And this is a smaller thing, but if you talk to one of the NPCs near the fountain, you can see that he was feeling down one day and Neuvillette just tried to encourage him by patting him on the back. There's an implied awkwardness though, as the NPC says that it only made things worse. Reading it, it sounds like Neuvillette was trying to encourage him through what felt like a normal human interaction. Maybe he saw other people comforting their friends that way. But he doesn't recognize that a gesture like that coming from the Chief Justice could feel very unnatural and thus make things more confusing and more awkward between them. So I think we were meant to find him endearing in the particularly gentle awkwardness that Kamiya-san instills into his performance. Of course, a lower voice can also endear us to a character. For example, I've heard the Korean dub myself, and his lower voice is instilled with warmth when we first meet. I've also heard that Ray Chase in the English dub chose to re-record his parts once he found out more about his character. But the reasons for the complaints against Kamiya's higher tone in the first place was because he did not sound authoritative enough. And that's a bias towards a personality for a character with a lower voice. So let's be real, many of us wanted to call him father before the Melusines did. And I think the Japanese dubbing team was trying to make the contrast between Neuvillette's appearance and his true personality even more distinct. Now for speculations on what the future will bring us. I actually have no idea, but since we are looking at the characters that Kamiya Hiroshi has portrayed in the past, let's see what ultimately happens to these types of characters. And will Neuvillette walk a path similar to theirs, or will his story surprise us in some other way? So, first, there are the characters that go through a self-discovery arc in which they realize that they are more eager to belong than they thought. Neuvillette may recognize that he's not the same as the people he lives among, and he may think he's simply performing in order to make things easier for their interactions. But he may find later on that he actually wants to fit in more than he knows. So one character who went on such a journey is Psyche, who realizes that he actually cherishes the company of those around him, despite all of his griping that he wishes to be left alone. He ultimately loves his family and has even tried to rewrite history multiple times to maintain the relationships that he does have. Izaya from Durara is actually a really fascinating take on this. He is a narcissist. He wants to hold himself above society as a god, but he's also kind of obsessed with humanity. And there is a reading of this character where you might see this desire as stemming from his wish to belong, but he simply is incapable of fitting in due to his sociopathy. So he settles for toying with the people around him. And at the core, most of the characters I've mentioned actually do desperately want to fit in. They've just convinced themselves that they are not able to anymore. Some of the characters also go through story arcs where they learn to look beyond the larger group that is society and focus on individuals. Perhaps he may go through an arc where he learns to look beyond his duty for the greater good. And at the start of Noragami, for example, Yato dreams about being an idol-like god with very many followers. Later on in the series, he fixates more on taking care of his first and single follower. He starts to change himself and his life in order to live up to her standards. There's also Rampo, who talks down to the police officers he works with. We find out that he started working with the president of the armed detective agency with the conviction of protecting humans who he sees as too stupid and helpless to fend for themselves. But after he finds a home with the detective agency, he does everything to protect the members of it. And finally, perhaps he will go through a character growth arc where he learns to value himself and rely on others more, rather than resigning himself to the role of babysitter of an entire nation and its archon. An example of a character like this is Natsume, who starts to build real relationships as the story progresses. He starts to recognize those he can lean on and even seeks help to resolve the cases of the yokai. But the best example of this is actually Araragi, who has to learn to love himself as much as the people that he wants to protect. He has to literally stop sacrificing his life for others at every given opportunity. So, whatever I was interrupted by Payman. Whatever path Neuvillette's story takes, though, I believe that they won't waste such a great voice actor and that his story is far from being over. I'm looking forward to seeing how he develops and what major changes he'll go through as a character. And that's basically it.